Thank you. Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon. Really lovely to be here. And we'll go straight to our panel. Anjum Hasan, Kanishk, and Mahesh, who are all fiction writers. This is a fiction panel. Anjum has written, her first book was Lunatic in My Head, and her latest is A Day in the Life, which is short stories. Kanishk has written this wonderful book called Swimmer Among the Stars, and you have written a beautiful book which marries Jane Austen and Delhi. Right, yeah. So among all the other things that they have also written, these I'm just telling you, the bios are there in the brochures. This session is labeled Form and Fiction. Fiction is, in a very simple way, a microcosm of what we see around us, but importantly filtered through the sensibilities and imagination of the various writers. And this vast material that every writer has, this vast clamoring that goes on in the head of every writer, how exactly do you put it in a form? And why is it that you use a particular form? Because there are so many forms of fiction these days: novel, short story, short, flash fiction, novellas, micro story, and of course the sagas, the family sagas, they are still here. So, and then there are all these genres, detective, thriller, romance, and all that. I would like to start by asking my panelists from that side onward, perhaps, how do you sort the material in your head? Because you, Anjum, have written poetry, long fiction, short fiction of various lengths. How do you sort, how do you put that? What is the mechanism, the mental mechanism by which you use this particular form to use? Why don't you write it as a poem, but as a short story, for instance, or as a book, for instance? Which is a very basic question. But let's begin with that.
Can you hear me? Yes? Yes, great. Okay, yes, so I do everything, or at least try to. But my latest book is a collection of short stories called A Day in the Life. And in some ways, I feel the short story form is just eminently suited to describing contemporary Indian life. Contemporary Indian middle-class life and its incredible churn, its incredible sense of instability, and the feeling that as a society there's just so much going on in the last 30 years, in the big cities, in the middle class, and that is sort of the canvas that I explore. And I think the short story can be so many things. It means so many things. What are you zoning in on when you say short story? Because we had the origins in the folk, right? You had the origins in a sort of community form. You had the fable, and then you had a reaction to that in the modern short story. Then the modern short story grew expansive and became more like a novel. It became novella-like, what we would call novella today. But there was a time in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when a short story could be 30,000 words. Henry James' short stories grew longer and longer and were still called short stories. Today, no one would call those short stories. And then the modernist short story became much more compressed. Much more the glimpse of something, much more the encounter with a stranger, much more the faceless individual in urban society, mass society. So I'm fascinated by this last thing, by this, the short story as an eminently suitable form for modern life. And that is what A Day in the Life is trying to do. And it's also a sense of impatience, I think. The fact that a novel requires you, there's a wonderful quote by Raymond Carver, and we all know, any short story writer has had to have some truck with Raymond Carver, whether a relationship of liking or disliking, but we all go past through Raymond Carver in some sense. And he's describing his life when he was trying to make it as a short story writer. He's very young, he married when he was in his teens, he's not well-to-do, he and his wife are struggling to make a living, and he just wants to have that 1 hour a day when he can write. And he says that the novel seems to be a form that lends itself to a world where things are the same from day to day. There's a sense of stability. You can wake up in the morning and say, this world is still in the same place it was yesterday. And he says, that's not the sense I had with my life. I didn't know how things would be the next day, and I could only see as far as the first of every month and the attempt to get some money in the bank and some food on the table. And I love that image of the world being so unstable that it's impossible to write a novel. And I feel like that on most days. Things are changing so fast. I have to grab it. I have to grab it and put it in a story. I'll give one last analogy. One last analogy which I have used before, which again I think is marvelous to describe short stories, and that is the Impressionist painters. You know, when the Impressionists started painting in Paris, again, urban life, they would set up their easels on the street. And they say that the sort of the hectic quality of their brush strokes, the flurry of their brush strokes, it mimicked the flurry of urban life. And again, I feel that's such a beautiful image for the short story, because things are changing so fast. People are walking so fast on the street. Newspapers are reporting things that are constantly changing. And that is, for me, like a riveting image for why the short story.
That's wonderfully put. Kanishk, so your Swimmer Among the Stars, you have a huge variety in all the stories of location, setting, characters, and even time, past and present and future. So I would think, I mean, the variety that you have put in your book of all these things, obviously the short story would be the medium, perhaps. Is that what you thought?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a convenient way for me to enclose between the covers, a lot of different kinds of subject matter, as you say, many different times and places. To go back to your initial question, I'm working on a novel now, and I obviously have published a book of short stories, so I'm thinking quite often about the difference of the form. You know, for me, in Swimmer Among the Stars, my book of short stories, there are, many of these stories have very specific, often a little bit strange conceits. And I think, for example, I have one story that is about an interview between anthropologists and the last speaker of a language, a story that imagines a dystopian future in which the United Nations is consigned to an orbiting hotel in outer space, a story that sort of rewrites a real story, something that actually happened when the Indian ambassador to Morocco sent an elephant to the princess of Morocco, and what happened to that elephant. In any case, these conceits are often, they're often easier to sustain in 30 pages, to sustain the credibility and to sustain, I suppose, what's plausible in the work of fiction, in a way that over the course of a 300-page novel, they might not be able to carry that weight. But I think, in addition to that, there is an intensity to a short story that isn't always there. Yeah, I think in writing a short story, it requires a kind of intensity that the sprawl of a novel allows you to drift away. I mean, I think, writing a short story is a bit like walking through a house, a specific confined space, whereas a novel is the opening of a window and looking out into a wider world. I think, as I wade into and am knee deep in a novel, I miss the intensity of writing a short story. I miss its concision. I miss the satisfaction of finishing a short story, certainly. And but they are very different forms, and not just a shorter version of the other.
No, of course not. Another thing I would like to ask, maybe I'll ask it later, but is that in this, because you mentioned this story, Swimmer Among the Stars, and the last speaker of the language. So was that, because then, you hear about these people where the language is vanishing and it's just, so are you influenced by these reports of these things, or is that a peg or is it something that, something that comes into your mind and then you think this story comes to you? Especially for this story, was that how it happened?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a subject, the extinction of languages. We live in a time where 50% of the world's languages are under threat and are disappearing at a rate that's never happened before. It's a function of many things, of globalization, also of the dominance of national languages around the world and their spread through telecommunications. And so it's not just English, it's, Bahasa Indonesian is responsible for the disappearance of many languages. And I wrote this story that was set in an unnamed mountain valley in a remote place it's a real place in my mind that I've been to, but I didn't feel the need to name it because this issue is so global. But to be honest with you, I became interested in the subject not because I was imagining people in distant places, in villages somewhere, losing their language, but actually because in New York City, where I grew up and live, it's at New York City where 800 languages are spoken, is a kind of laboratory, a graveyard of endangered languages. And in fact, there are languages spoken in New York City that have died out in their place of origin. So I have a friend who is an anthropologist researching them, and I got interested in the subject that way, actually, through being in New York and seeing it there.
Yes, that actually grabbed me, because where I come from, India's northeast, in Arunachal Pradesh, Anjum will know, languages are being lost at a very rapid rate as well. So this is true in so many parts of the world. So Mahesh, we come to you, polite society. The obvious thing that comes to my mind, would you like to say about what the other two have said? The first question.
I'd just say that with the short stories I write and the ones that I like to read, I generally start with a moment of transformation. There's a pivot somewhere in the story that acts as a metamorphosis for the characters, and that would usually dictate the form, how much has to come before and how much after. I'd echo what Kanishk said about the intensity of a short story. I mean, I think that the short story form has more metaphors about it than any other form. I mean, you talked about it being a house that you can walk through. I've heard it called a bullet, that just sort of streams through your consciousness. But I think my particular favorite is Jackie Kay, the short story writer's metaphor for it, which is a radioactive green cabbage. If you take your short story and leave it in a field, it should glow in the middle of the night with its intensity. And to me, it's just a very visual way of seeing, what the form can do. I mean, there is great pleasure in knowing that you can finish it within, whatever it takes, 3 weeks, a month, whatever. Yeah, and just the fact that there is a sense of momentum. So there are lots of sort of pleasurable things about it, and but also that you have to be brutal with the economy of your language. There is no space for any bagginess or any slack, unlike a novel, which has that capaciousness and the elasticity to portray a long narrative arc. But a different kind of novel is the one that I have just written, because it's a reimagining. So it means that I cheated. I already had something of a framework in Jane Austen's Emma, and you might think, oh well, it's just like terribly lazy, and This
No,
is-
I didn't think that.
no, but this is, no, I did wonder it myself, you know, is this a cop-out? Is this someone being too lazy to actually come up with a plot of their own? And I must admit, there is a tiny little grain of truth in that, because it is a tremendous relief to know that there is this framework and you have these story arcs with which to work. But it's a false reassurance, because I think the worst thing you can do with a reimagining is to tread the original path so heavily that you end up with this vastly inferior copy of the original text. And for me, the challenge with this always was to find points of departure. I mean, the world really does not need another bad Jane Austen readaptation. I think we can all agree on that.
Lots of them are there. No, not everything is as good as Polite Society.
Well, thank you, but there is this whole Jane Austen industry, you know. I mean, it's sort of phenomenal, you know. I mean, I remember going to the gift shop of her house in England, which is now a museum, Chawton. And if you go into the gift shop, I mean, it's this sort of sea of pink and yellow, and you know there are sort of Pride and Prejudice quotes on throw cushions and sort of fudge boxes and all sorts of cursive writing. And I think Jane Austen herself would have been appalled at how her incredibly astute and sharp writing has, in many ways, the sort of the commercial aspect of it, the commerce of it, has reduced it to this slightly, dreamy, girly, romance type commodities, you know. And of course there is romance in the novels, but what they mainly are,
so much more.
They're incredibly acute social satires and observations. And actually they're all about money. They're about money and marriage, and actually what could be more suited to Lutyens' Delhi than money and marriage.
So I was going to ask you, in any case, this juxtaposition, Emma, Jane Austen, and modern day Delhi, how did it come? But I think you've kind of answered it. Would you like to elaborate?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, for me, Emma is always, at its heart, was about social mobility, or the lack thereof, but in a very, very different time. And the amazing thing about Emma, it really is that she's a pretty unlikable character. You know, she does fairly despicable things right through the book, but in some way, Austen's genius is that you somehow still engage with this character and everything she does, and you stay with her. And I found this quite a difficult thing to transplant into modern day Delhi, because Emma was very much a creature of her society, her sort of limited education, and the small world that she occupied. Whereas, an heiress in modern-day Lutyens' Delhi would have had far more advantages. There's very little excuse for that kind of bad behavior, but the truth is that Lutyens' Delhi abounds in all sorts of terrible behavior, and so it was actually very, very easy to
juxtapose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's interesting. So I'd like to come now to another aspect about this. A lot of writers I know, and I'm sure you know as well, the method by which you write fiction, because poetry does not require this kind of method. But I know people who are drawing graphs, making computer simulations, and all kinds of things. So what is the way each one of you goes about, especially in a novel, but also in a short story and a novel? Because these are projects that you are handling so many characters, so many things, so many time zones and all that. So each one of you, how do you go about this?
Well, the theme of this panel is form.
Right.
And your question is also related in some ways to form, and to
yeah.
craft. But I think there's another layer to the question, which is to do with the imagination. I
Absolutely.
sometimes teach creative writing, and when you talk about writing in terms of form and in terms of craft, which you do in a creative writing context, the questions all become: how do you do plot? How do you do dialogue? How do you write? How do you create the question you just asked? But I think there's Also the question which cannot be answered, and which is the most important question, which has to do with imagination. How do you imagine a story? Whether you're writing a short story or a novel or fiction in any form. And that is the great imponderable, right? That's the thing that we sort of try and approach from different sides, but we can never really answer. And I think that question about imagination takes just any discussion on writing away from this sort of universal, located anywhere global discussion and roots it in some context. So when I try to think about imagination, I have to ask myself, who am I? As a writer of fiction in English in India, sitting in Bangalore or sitting in Shillong, what are my coordinates? And I think to write in English as an Indian is a uniquely strange thing to be doing, because we are channeling so many different kinds of sources and so many different kinds of traditions. We may be reading in our own languages, we're reading in translation, we're reading Western literature, we're reading literature of our contemporaries written in English. So somehow all that unique mix and that unique sense of inheritance is something we don't reflect on enough. We tend to ask the questions about writing in terms of the more general,
form.
Yeah, in terms
Structure.
of craft, in terms of form. And I think to ask the question about imagination is to ask it in terms of a problem. Is to say, what was the problem that Salman Rushdie was addressing when he wrote Midnight's Children? And I think he is trying to creatively address a problem, which is the weirdness of being someone from a particular class in newly independent India, right? Or take a novelist like U.R. Ananthamurthy, the great Kannada novelist who's translated beautifully by A.K. Ramanujan. There again, there's a sense of a problem. What happens when tradition comes, or traditional norms come in conflict with a modern consciousness? So I think every novelist that way has some, or every writer of fiction has some kind of a project, and the imagination is what you're bringing to bear on addressing that question or that problem. So I haven't at all answered your question, which is how do I write? How do I write?
But I'm glad.
In terms of, but I think that there are these more sort of, like I said, imponderable questions to do with the imagination, which it is.
I understand.
Yeah.
You address that first of all. Obviously, the imagination, and then the question that you said about, where you are located as a writer. As a writer, what are you making, the kind of sense you're making, and what you are putting on the paper, on the computer. That is the thing. But the craft of writing, I would like to just address it for a little bit.
In my case, I think that...
Because you write poetry as well, and that must be a very different...
Yeah, I think sometimes the idea suggests the form. If there is an idea that requires me to stay with it for a while and to explore it through sub-stories, sub-characters, I have to create a universe. Like Auden said, the novelist has to be the whole of boredom. So if I want to encompass the whole of boredom and describe something comprehensively, whether it's the story of a life, or it's the story of a particular period in the life of a city, or it's a particular kind of subculture, you need to write a novel. It's much harder, it's much more painful, but that's what you have
like
to do.
Lunatic.
Like Lunatic in my head, my first novel, I wanted to describe a particular era in the city of Shillong through the eyes of these three characters. And there is a sense of trying to describe a culture. You can't do that in a story, right? So,
No, you need much more space.
You need much more space, and I love the idea or the possibility that a novel allows of the sort of the sub-stories, the sub-characters, the small things. The woman in a shop selling something, or the guy selling street food, and there'll be a vignette just with that, and that all builds up in its sense of detail. It's a slow accretion of detail that then creates a universe. You can't do that.
I remember very vividly the peanut seller.
Alu Muri.
Alu Muri in Don Bosco Square. Yeah.
Mitra is also from Shillong. We went to the same school.
For briefly, yeah.
Yes, so that sort of thing. How do you create the sense of the life of a city,
Place.
of a place? It's much harder to do in a short story. There are different aims in a short story. So when I'm writing a short story set in Bangalore, I'm assuming the reader already knows something or recognizes something here. I don't have to create that whole universe. With a novel, I'm taking pleasure in doing that. That's the aim. So I don't feel the need to choose. I feel like I can do the poem or the short story or the novel,
Right,
depending on what.
Yes.
On what.
So the subject will,
The
in a way,
subject and the
dictate-
impulse. I think the impulse more than the subject, because we are not journalists. We are not writing fiction out of a journalistic aim, right? We're not saying we are explicating on a subject in a particular way in a short story, a particular way in the novel. It's, again, to come back to the word I used earlier, it's imagination. So it's more the impulse. What is the impulse here? Is it to create a world or is it to create a glimpse?
So Kanishk?
Yeah, I mean, to respond to some of the things Anjum just said, I teach as well creative writing, which is a very strange thing actually, to teach creative writing. I found, as both somebody who studied it in the West and is now teaching it, that it's very odd that there is a lot of time spent on talking about the how of fiction, of craft, of technique, of form. And very little time spent talking about why it's important to write about certain subjects in fiction or frankly any form. There can be this tendency to treat all material as equal, and that the only thing that separates it is method, is craft. And I try to encourage my students to think a little bit in the way that Anjum is saying about where they are writing from, what they may be writing towards in terms of, what is the sort of larger social place of the narrative they're trying to compose. Obviously, I'm not trying to be didactic about it. There are many purposes for fiction, but I think it helps to realize that you're not writing in a vacuum. Especially for people who want to take writing seriously, that you are inevitably in conversation with other stories, with things happening in the world, and I think there's insufficient time spent in the sort of creative writing industry to describe it as such, on the why and too much on the how. But then about form and about radioactive cabbages.
Yes.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, the craft of it, the form of it. Yeah.
Well, you asked how I write. I think with this book of short stories, some of these stories came out of my reading, and I'm happy to be inspired by the things I read and I encounter in my research and in newspapers. And, I have a story that is slightly fanciful. It's set in, as I said, in outer space. It imagines the UN in outer space at a time when climate change has ravaged the world and there's no real safe place for it. And that was actually inspired by a story I read about how one of the parliaments in war-torn Libya was meeting on a Greek car ferry in the Mediterranean, so that they had been chased out of territorial Libya and were trying to administer the affairs of the nation. And this is in real life, from this luxury car ferry parked several miles off the coast. And I thought there was something so farcical and tragic about that I wanted to take it into its sort of logical extreme, which was the United Nations in space. So I mean a moment like that can be a source of it. Sometimes there are experiences that I've had. Often when I'm writing a story, though, I'll have a line or an image that will have struck me, and part of the exercise of writing the short story will be sort of explaining to myself where that line came from or where that image came from, or finding a route to that image. Obviously, in writing a novel, it's quite different. I'm somewhat more deliberate. I'm writing a novel now. I have to be slightly more deliberate. I'm not drafting tables and charts or anything like that, or running computer models. But maybe I am imagining in my mind a pathway to a huge incandescent field of glowing cabbages. To elaborate on that analogy. But it is more deliberate, and I think some of the pleasure of writing short stories is that you can be a bit more scattered in your method.
So, Mahesh?
I mean, I agree. The idea of having a spreadsheet for all your characters.
People
just,
do, I believe.
I believe they do, but it sort of
yes.
fills me with horror. I mean, I think
It
one
does.
of the few advantages I think of doing this as a career is that you don't have to use a spreadsheet. You know, so the idea of inflicting it upon yourself is, to me, seems a little bit perplexing. But whatever works for you. But as someone who has neither studied creative writing nor taught it really, I would say that. The thing that has taught me almost everything I know is reading. That this is, I mean, I think reading sort of almost acts as a kind of geology. Everything you've ever read probably settles in you somewhere, and there are layers that build up over time, and it's not even a conscious process, but you somehow just dig deep. You dig deep, and there are things that in your reading history that just come bubbling up to the surface. The more you read, which is why I never really understand. I mean, you do meet writers at some of these events who say they don't read, and to me, it's this kind of phenomenally perplexing thing. I just don't understand that. But in terms of imagination, I think also imagination very often needs a kickstart, and this is one reason why I'm very grateful to the work of journalists, because quite a few of my stories have been sparked by the work of journalists who've gone out and found stories that you sitting in your pajamas at home would never have, the possibilities involved there wouldn't really have come to you. And an example of this is, I remember ages ago I read an article, I think it was in India Today magazine actually, about more than a decade ago, and it was a piece about female pastors in Punjab who were going around converting Hindus and Sikhs to Christianity. And, I thought this was this kind of very sort of odd and visually arresting thing of a woman attending prayer meetings, and not just attending, but leading prayer meetings in rural Punjab, and spearheading these conversion drives. And it just spun into all sorts of thoughts for me, like what would that kind of a woman be? What would her family think about this?
Character.
Yeah, the character. I mean, the piece was a very short piece about the phenomenon of it happening,
That's where the imagination kicks in.
Yeah, that's where all the other questions sort of branch out from this initial spark, There was very little detail in this piece, apart from maybe that this project was being funded by, evangelical organizations abroad or whatever. But to me, fleshing out that woman, her family life, her character, that's where the imagination very often takes over from something that is rooted in, in journalism or in science. And I often try and read things that are completely disconnected to the kind of fiction I read. I mean, I have a cousin who wrote a thesis on genetics, and it involves apparently the gold standard of worms, which they experiment on. And the name of this worm is C. elegans, which, again, this is not my world, but the fact that your life in a lab is completely absorbed by a worm, and the worm's name is C. elegans. For me, it's the kind of spark that could lead
Absolutely.
To the opening
I
up
can
of a whole world. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm so glad Mahesh, you've talked about the way we are indebted to journalists, because several times, especially in my first novel, Collector's Wife, which was happening during all the unrest in Assam and so on, I could see it around me, of course, but I was really indebted to the journalists who were giving all these reports about what was happening. And since none of you really answered my question, I'm going to answer it myself, which is that, yes, I used to make newspaper cuttings. Okay, cuttings, and then not really make spreadsheets and flow charts and things, but kind of look at them from time to time, which perhaps, I don't know if you did it, but perhaps, and Anjum, you'd like to add to that, yeah.
Well, yeah, talking about journalism, I have a story in A Day in the Life, which is based on a couple of months of newspaper reports in Bangalore about sort of random meaningless acts of violence. And I was drawing on actual newspaper reports that the character is reading in real time. But the question always for me is, so it's journalism, of course, is invaluable often as a source of the facts or as a source of
Absolutely. And what's happening?
Inspiration, a source of information, but how do you transform that? And so when I'm using the word imagination, what do I mean? I don't necessarily mean just the ability to make things up. That's what it's usually taken to mean. That if you're imaginative as a writer, you're inventive. You can create things out of nothing, or you can embroider things in a way that are alluring. But I think for me, imagination is also the capacity to transform something that is familiar, right? It's not only about fantasy. Fantasy is very popular as a genre right now, and especially younger readers are drawn to fiction that takes you out of yourself. Fiction is a form of escape, which is all very well, but how does fiction also bring you back to yourself? How does fiction become something that enables you to recognize rather than escape? To see the same thing in a new light, right? So Kanishk wants to say something, after which I'm going to read.
Okay. I have one more question for all of you. No,
Well, I actually, it's interesting because in my limited experience of encountering students, I find that they tend to write too much about themselves. And that for me, that they tend to write too much about themselves, that in fact they see fiction as a vehicle for sort of recasting their own experiences. Whereas I think there's a potentially greater, well not greater, but equal power in fiction that is not to take them out of themselves, but rather to take them into the world, to take readers into a tangible, real, meaningful world, history as well. That is
curiosity.
great. Yeah,
so fiction as a basis or as an avenue
curiosity
that
and engagement. I think, especially in the social media age we live in, there is a great risk of solipsism. There is a great risk of seeing yourself as the full source of meaning. Now, I think there are many powerful memoirs, but I think fiction serves a different function than a memoir. I think fiction has to bring us into the world in a meaningful way. And you've mentioned that in thinking about context and place, and as long as fiction is engaged in that kind of thing, it will achieve that.
Yeah, but what I was also referring to is the tendency now to treat, I mean, I heard this story from a friend or colleague who teaches a lot of creative writing, and there was this student there who was presented, in fact, I think with Jane Austen, and she said, this is not fiction, because this is so real, this is real, this is like for her fiction was George R.R. Martin and Harry Potter. That was fiction, because it was not about our world. So in that sense, we have 5 minutes.
Oh, we are only.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that's the sense in which I meant that fiction needn't be fantasy in the escapist sense. It could also be about our worlds, which is what.
Yeah, but a quick thing for all of you, 2 sentences each, is that do you feel the inadequacies of this form sometimes as opposed to non-fiction essays and so on? Do you feel that this is not adequate enough, fiction in different forms is not adequate enough to put across what you're trying to say, and so you take some other form?
Well, I do write essays as well, and I do write.
We all do, I think.
Yeah. So, but no, I think it would be a crazily claustrophobic world if you only had the facts,
Right.
and you only had to dwell on the facts in a factual way. I mean, fiction allows you to do so much more, to introduce so many more elements, so much more nuance, so much more perspective than any non-fiction, however rich, can. So I think for me, I absolutely don't feel the inadequacy of the form. What I feel is the inadequacy of myself, of exploiting the potential of the form.
Kanishk?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it's one of my favorite kinds of work is the sort of, I suppose, not dubious, but tricky writing of writers like Ryszard Kapuscinski and other journalists who have written ostensibly non-fiction, but in often fiction modes. And I think that's potentially the most powerful kind of work. That is, written in the register and with the imaginative power of a fiction writer, but dealing with things that have actually happened. I don't necessarily see fiction as inadequate to the task. I think there are ways that allows you to reimagine and think of the world, to estrange the familiar, as Anjum was talking about, that no other form can really achieve. So I don't think it's inadequate, but I also don't want to necessarily see such a great distinction between the two.
Right. Yeah. And Mahesh, I think you'll get the last word.
I'll be very brief. I think fiction can do absolutely anything and everything, and the inadequacies that writers feel are their own.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. So do we have time for some readings, maybe, since nobody... So, to open it, okay. And now there's 23 left. Oh, it's not working. So there are no readings, it seems, right? 5 minutes? It's not enough. Maybe we should find out if there are questions, and if there are not. Right. If there are not enough questions, then we'll get back to this. So, any questions?
Hello. I feel very happy and very proud also to see two writers from Northeast here. It's a sort of, you are bringing the so-called margin to the center. So, am I audible now? Yeah. What I'm saying that I'm feeling very happy and proud to see two writers from Northeast India here. It is a sort of, you are bringing the margin to the center. And I should say congratulations to you. And I also should say that it's raising my hope and expectations that you are getting a widened readership. So my question is related to that, to Mitra and to Anjum, that how do you read, as writers, how do you read the expectation and the hope of the readers as you are writers from Northeast? Do you feel that there's a particular expectation from you people? Number one. Number two, just one more. Okay, thank you.
Anjum, you answer that. No, you and then maybe me.
What I've noticed lately is that I've become academic fodder for people who are doing academic writing on the Northeast. So it's become very, I don't know if you've experienced this, Mitra, but it's suddenly become, or suddenly, not so suddenly, but gradually in the last, say, 5 years or maybe a decade or so, that suddenly Northeast writing is being seen as something
to be put on panels.
And to be written about in an academic sense. So I don't know if that means ossification or it's a sign of something enlivening.
I really wouldn't know, but I answer your question, actually when any reader writes, I don't think the reader as such during the process of writing is that much in the mind. It's a question of, you have something within you to say, and then it is, you are saying that, and then later on when the editing process starts, then you feel that, okay, somebody outside this region, because I'm rooted in Guwahati, somebody may not understand, for instance, the word bihu, for instance, the word deota, all of that. So then you perhaps do a little bit of contextualizing and a few words here and there. But otherwise, I don't think the reader is such there. But Anjum, I think, in a way, it's better than nothing, because what we are called the periphery was not even in the consciousness of the nation before. So, though sitting there, we were not thinking of ourselves as the periphery. So, I mean, okay, it doesn't matter what label you're putting on us, as long as you read us. It doesn't matter really. So if I, not you, you're in Bangalore now, but if I am to be from the periphery, it doesn't matter. If you're reading me as somebody from the periphery, it doesn't matter, just read me. And then the takeaway is yours, whatever you take away.
My question is for Kanishk, because you mentioned the fact that how important it is to understand why, to recognize the whys of it, not just the hows of it. So why and in what circumstances would you consider short story format for the idea that you have, and not just, apart from the fact that, it's a brief kind of situation, brief idea that you have, apart from the word length, in what circumstances would you consider short story for your idea? Thank you.
I think, thanks for the question. I think I was hinting at it before, but there are, I do think that there are ways in which a subject determines its own length. So if I have, if I have a certain idea that, I mentioned a few, I found that in the writing of them, they found their natural length. And so the novel I'm working on is something initially that I thought maybe I could try as a short story, but in the process of writing, it just spiraled out. And I realized I was entering into a wider world, that I needed to build this out, and that it deserved, at least from me, the attempt at a novel. I think that the 2 points are slightly separate. I think when you're writing fiction, the why of fiction is not necessarily about the length, it's about why the subject deserves your attention as a writer and presumably the attention of readers too. But when you're figuring out the form, that's more about, I think, the process of writing. And I found that, there's certain stories that really would pack a bigger punch if in a more confined form of a short story.
Hello, my name is Roshan. I want to ask the question to Anjum. Like as you're talking about imagination, so how you distinguish between a poetry imagination and short story imagination when you write?
I don't think it matters so much. I think what matters is precision. There is a poet called Ezra Pound, I don't know if you've heard of him, who said, precision of expression, I'm paraphrasing him, precision of expression is the only morality of writing. So all that matters really is if you can use your imagination with precision. Right? When you're writing a poem or a short story, yes, you are operating in slightly different modes, you're channeling different histories, you're thinking of the poems you've read when you're writing poetry, you're thinking of the fiction you've read when you're writing fiction, but to me that is less important than how well you can use your imagination to hone in on what you want to say. So I think there are two things. There's the precision of expression, and there is what we've been talking about earlier, the freedom to imagine. How much liberty can you give yourself to imagine, and how precisely can you describe what you have given yourself the liberty to imagine? I think these two things combined may take you very close to it, if not to the center of it.
My question is, as writers, do you believe in the power of outlining cultural tropes vis-a-vis, say, spontaneous imagination? Say, for instance, in Urdu poetry, they may refer to Mir Taki Mir or Ghalib as stalwarts. Is it spontaneous, as in creative expression, do you place larger trust in that, or do you think, say, for fiction writing, plotting is also part of the mix?
Who is it addressed to? Anybody? Mahesh, would you like to take?
I think it very much depends on the sort of idea you have and the sort of book you want to write. I mean, there are people who are incredibly organized and sort of have well thought out plans well in advance. There are sort of reams of post-its and charts, and they know exactly what's going to happen. And then there is another type of writer, and I count myself in that number, where you just basically try to wing it. You sort of know about character. I usually know very well about character, but I very often don't know what they're going to do or how they're going to end up. And you just sort of repose your faith in some kind of solution that will emerge at some point, that the better you know your characters, the more situations you feel you can put them in, there is a kind of alchemy that occurs, and the arc resolves itself. And I know that's not a terribly helpful answer, but it's very often how it happens. And I would certainly say walking is amazing. I mean, walking, there is something about the free-fall process of just walking endlessly, which makes ideas just emerge out of nothing. And I've heard writers say this about swimming as well. There is something about mechanical, repeated action which just cranks ideas out of your head. So you know, that's something I recommend.
But you know, in comparing Urdu poetry contemporary fiction, that's like apples and oranges, because Urdu poetry is a very stylized, formalized tradition where there's a tendency to invoke the greats or the elders, right? What would be a more interesting comparison would be contemporary Urdu fiction, which is in fact quite, the word you use, spontaneous, while being strongly rooted in a tradition, but not in any obvious sense, to contemporary English. I think that's a more, that's a more productive comparison than with the poetry.
I just have one question. It's a very general question, but all of you have been writing for a while now, and when you had started off, if there was one piece of advice probably someone would have given you as about the storytelling format or just how to write or how to approach it, what would that advice have been, just for people who want to enter the field of writing? Is there any specific advice that you would have given, you wish you would have been told?
Can I start, and then, because one bit of advice which I did not take, and then everybody else will say this. I was advised when I began to write decades ago, why are you writing in English? Write in Assamese, okay? And I didn't, and so that was one advice which has, and it's always kind of, you know, whenever it's still said, but not so much these days. So I would like to say that just do your thing. Don't really go by what the advice is, because you are an individual, and then we are all individuals, and it is up to us to do our own thing.
I think one of the most important things I'd say is it's not got so much to do with writing, but it's to do with how to deal with failure. And I think we never talk about this enough, because writers, almost at any stage of your career, there is a constant spate of rejections that you have to deal with. And you know, we often talk about success, we talk about, you know, having millions of books in translation, et cetera, having sold all these copies, but the reality, I think, very often of a writer's life is dealing with rejection. Sometimes they're kind, sometimes they're unkind, and it's getting back on the horse and continuing to write in the face of repeated failure. I think that is a thing that you kind of learn a little bit as you go on, but it never gets easy. And I think that constant negotiation of your relationship with failure is something that I think we should all think about a lot and talk about a lot.
I think that's very true. And I think one of the ways to deal with the inevitable potential of rejection is to have conviction in yourself. And that sense of conviction often comes from discipline, from having the discipline to write from a young age. And I wish I had, when I was younger, in my early 20s especially, that I had more discipline. So I would suggest, you know, go out less, drink less, and make sure you get the hours that you create the time from a young age, if you're serious about it, to develop that discipline. I think that's, you know, the writers I know who have been prolific for a long time, I mean, that may not necessarily be a good thing, are the most disciplined. And, you know, you don't have to write a novel every year, but to have that sense, that ability to return to the page every day, it takes a kind of muscle that you have to maintain.
I think in my case, the fact that I started with poetry was a good thing, because it helped me focus or get obsessed with language. And I sometimes meet younger writers who say, I have a great idea, but I don't have the language in which to write it. And I don't think there's any such thing as a great idea that is not in language. Ideas exist in language only. I mean, we tend to forget this in this era of Netflix, when we're separating, you know, plot and storytelling from the story itself, from the language in which it is written. So if I had to sort of remember or pass on a piece of advice, it would be to pay attention to language, because I really don't believe that literary ideas can exist outside language.
I think a couple of more questions can be taken, and no time for readings. We need another panel for that.
Hello. My question was to you, Mitra ma'am. You were talking about how Indian writers who write in English, we need to sometimes contextualize what we're writing. Do you feel that it limits you in any way, or are there things that you leave out because it would need too much contextualization? Because, I mean, you'd be writing for you hope to be writing for a universal audience and not just a very limited sect. So my question basically is, does it limit you while you're writing, the need to contextualize since you're an Indian writer?
See, how it works for me only I can say. I don't know how it works for others. Two things. First of all, sometimes I have to contextualize even for Assamese readers, okay? For instance, when I am writing about Hotriya dance, which is, you know, the dance form of Majuli Island and so on, many Assamese today do not know those forms, or, you know, they may not be that much aware. So I will have to contextualize whether I am writing in Assamese or whether I am writing in English or any other language. So that is there. And then, during the first draft, the first writing, I don't really go into the contextualization. As I said, Bihu, for instance, I just write, so they went to a Bihu performance or something. Later on, while editing, we all go through the process of a lot of editing of ourselves before we send it off. So during that, I feel, okay, this somebody sitting here in Jaipur may not understand what Bihu is. So then I put in, it's just 1 or 2 words. So it will not limit, it does not actually limit, at least me. I'm sure it doesn't limit others as well.
We have time for one last question. We have 2 minutes.
Oh.
Hi, this question is for all of you. It's about when you were talking about when you get an idea from wherever, from a press clipping or from anywhere, and you decide to add your imagination to it and write something about it. Do you ever think about an audience and how they will take it? For example, Kanishk, you've written something about the UN being in space. So it's a bit of a far-fetched thing. Do you ever think about, will people, I mean, how's the audience reaction going to be for it? Will there be readers for it?
I suppose when I think of an audience, I never really think about it in terms of a national audience or a regional audience. I hope when I'm writing, you know, my stories and my novel as well, it doesn't really come out of a particular country. I'm interested in different places and different time periods, and I suppose, you know, there is a bit of border hopping in the work I do. So I'm not imagining a particular population as a writer when I'm writing. That's not true for everybody, but you know, I suppose I am thinking when I write of people who, like me, are interested in things out there, whether it's politics, whether it's history, whether it's the way certain major events and changes in the world affect human lives. I'm my imagined reader as I write, because I suppose I do have an imagined reader, is somebody who shares some of those sensibilities, and that's not an audience defined by age or by country. It's just an adventurous reader. I'm sure the others have different answers to that question.
Is that okay? So we are done. Thank you so much. You've been a very wonderful panel and a very wonderful audience. Thank you.
We wish to thank our speakers, Anjum Hasan, Kanishk Tharoor, Mahesh Rao, and Mitra Phukan. This session was presented by Dainik Bhaskar.